the time, Mr. Lamb, I'm quite overwhelmed by your kind reception. But I think I must begin by saying that I have in fact given the medical profession two pieces of good news. You mentioned one, but the other is that 1 glass of wine a day does reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. So I think I better stop there because most of the other news is not too good. Well, I'm going to talk about epidemiology and some contributions that it has made to science, to medical science. It's one of the oldest branches of medical science and was for many years among the most important. I think for the good reason that its study required only the use of records, simple arithmetic, and some clinical acumen, and I have to admit that that's what attracted me to it. Well, beginning with the study of mass statistics and morbidity, it came to be recognized as a separate specialty in the 19th century and identified with the study of epidemics of infectious disease. And it was so identified when I began to undertake medical research after the Second World War. In fact, its use in the study of the etiology of chronic non-infectious disease does in fact date back at least a century earlier to the work described so very clearly by Hirsch in Germany under the head of geographical and temporal pathology, which is what it was called in those days. Its use in the study of such diseases played only a minimal role in his 3 volumes, but he did have brief sections on cancer and hypertension and longer ones on other chronic diseases that in the spirit of the times were thought of as being infective, but which we now know are not, such as the avitaminoses, gout, and later onset diabetes. The expansion of its use to cover all sorts of disease, and indeed also of physiological variations, emerged gradually only after the First World War, but didn't gather pace until after the Second World War, when it was my good fortune to have the opportunity of working with Professor Sir Austin Bradford Hill and in his Medical Research Council's Statistical Research Unit. Now, the breakthrough really in the development of epidemiology came in 1947, when Bradford Hill was asked to find out what had caused the enormous increase in the mortality from lung cancer. And if you could show the first slide for me, please. We had this dramatic this quite dramatic increase in mortality from this disease. It had been so great that in men in the United Kingdom, in a period of only 30 years, the mortality had increased 20 times, even after allowing for the increase in the proportion of old people, which of course increased the risk of cancer in the population. Now, Hill and I consequently designed a study in which inquiries were made of patients with and without the disease, using a detailed questionnaire about their past exposure to all the factors that we could think of that might have affected the bronchi and had increased at an appropriate time before the increase in the incidence of the disease. For our controls without the disease, we chose patients matched with the lung cancer patients by sex, age, hospital admission, and approximate time of interview. By the end of 1949, the findings for these pairs of patients led us to conclude, and I'll show you some of the results shortly, that cigarette smoking is an important cause of the disease. Now, to reach our conclusion, I'm afraid I haven't got an illustration of it, but the conclusion, of course, was based on the fact that the risk increased in proportion to the number of cigarettes smoked. But to reach our conclusion, we had first to exclude chance as an explanation, which was not difficult, as the differences between the proportions of lifelong non-smokers in the lung cancer and control groups were so great that it would have only expected to have occurred less than once in a million similar studies. Secondly, we had to exclude recall and selection biases. Now, as it happened, we had interviewed patients with a suspicion of a diagnosis of lung cancer, and it was only after they left hospital we were able to confirm whether or not they actually had the disease. And so we could compare those patients that were suspected of having lung cancer but proved not to have it with the controls. And if I have the next slide. Now, this has gone too far here. Yeah. Yes. This is a comparison of the distribution of the smoking habits versus a proportion of the total. For the lung cancer patients suspected of having a disease who were interviewed as such, but who didn't have it, and the controls with other diseases, and you see the distribution of smoking habits was practically identical. And that was effectively excluded recall bias on the part of the patient, or any bias on the part of the interviewers. And then the next slide shows that we could similarly exclude. Now, that I did not wish to do. It was bringing on the lights, is what I didn't wish to do. Yeah. No, I want to get rid of those lights. How do we turn the lights out? Thank you. So we were able to exclude selection bias on the part of the interviewers who had chosen the control patients, because no, we haven't moved on yet, have we? We want the next one. We had two other groups of patients notified to us as having gastric and large bowel cancer, as well as having lung cancer, and we were able to compare their smoking habits with the smoking habits of the controls selected by the interviewers, and again we see that these distributions were just the same, so we could eliminate those two forms of bias. Thirdly, then, of course, we had to exclude confounding. That is the possibility that the differences we'd observed in smoking habits were due to smoking being associated with some other factor that was even more strongly related to the disease. This we could exclude only by common sense. It wasn't caused by socioeconomic differences or urban living, but we couldn't think of anything that could possibly be so closely associated with the disease as to and with smoking as to justify the assumption that it was confounding that has caused these results. And so we were able to conclude that smoking was the cause. Well, finally, we examined our conclusion to see if it made biological sense and fitted with known ecological factors. We noted in regard to the former that the risk diminished with years since smoking was stopped, and with increasing age it was restarted, and that it increased with the amount smoked per day, in that the risk was more marked for smokers of cigarettes than of pipes or cigars, and with regard to the latter, the ecological observations, that the increase occurred at an appropriate time after the increase in cigarette smoking, was greater in countries in which the prevalence of smoking was high, and very low in some countries where, like Iceland, where cigarette smoking was very uncommon. It was very low in cultural groups such as the Parsis, who didn't smoke, and greater in men than in women, men having smoked more than women. So that was enough to convince us. Taken all together, we thought that the evidence was conclusive. But it didn't appear to be so to those who specialize in research on cancer, or in the care of cancer patients, or even to those who had to advise the Department of Health. We had consequently to think of some other independent way of testing our belief. We chose what we thought what would now be thought of as a standard approach, but wasn't so then, namely to undertake a cohort study, a type of study which we originally called a prospective one, as it looked forward from knowledge of exposure to the development of the disease, in contrast to the case-controlled study that we carried out, which was retrospective as it looked back from the occurrence of the disease to exposures of the past. In this instance, we sought to identify individuals with different smoking habits and to follow them up to see if knowledge of their habits would allow their risk of developing cancer of the lung to be predicted. We chose doctors to study, principally because they would be easy to follow, because they had to keep their names on a national register if they wished to continue to practice. In fact, it turned out to be a very wise decision, because when we showed that actually doctors were dying of lung cancer as they smoked, they somehow took this seriously and passed the information on to their patients. With the help of the British Medical Association, we wrote to all the doctors known to be domiciled in Britain and received usable replies from about 2/3, including over 34,000 men. Within 2.5 years, the results confirmed those we had obtained in the case control study. May I have the next slide? This slide shows the relationship between smoking and lung cancer obtained in our retrospective study of patients in control, and in the prospective study of people with known smoking habits. And the relationship you see was linear, and it was practically identical by the two methods. Within 5 years, however, which was the length of time for which we had planned the study to be carried out, they had begun to show that smoking might also cause other diseases, most notably coronary thrombosis. This seemed potentially so important that we changed our mind and continued to study for longer, and we've now continued it for over 50 years, with periodic updates of changes in habits along the way, and with Professor Richard Peto substituting for Professor Bradford Hill as my colleague since the 1960s. Our most detailed results were published after following the doctors for 40 years. They revealed positive relationships with over 20 conditions that would seem most likely to be causal in character, and one negative relationship, that is with Parkinsonism. Data for the 20 conditions that we found most closely related with smoking are summarized in the next two slides. If I may have the table. This shows the conditions that were most closely related to smoking. I've shown the numbers of men and the rates in non-smokers, and what else? I can't remember what I showed. In the ex-smokers, the light smokers, the moderate smokers, and the heavy smokers. And these are the relationships that are most closely the relationship in the non-smokers being one. So it's in proportion to the risk in the lifelong non-smokers. These were cancers of the mouth, pharynx and larynx, cancer of the esophagus, cancer of the lung, of course, pulmonary heart disease, aortic aneurysm, and chronic obstructive lung disease and peptic ulcer. So those are the most closely related. The next slide, please, shows a series of other conditions which were less closely related. One that is perhaps interesting to draw your attention to, apart from myocardial infarction, which of course affects so many people, is pulmonary tuberculosis, which it took a long time for people to recognise was aggravated by smoking, which is quite an extraordinary thing. When I was an assistant in the tuberculosis department shortly after I qualified, doing artificial pneumothorax, which was the only treatment we had at that time, no one considered for a moment that you should advise the patient not to smoke. It is now one of the most important effects of smoking in countries like India, where there is a great deal of pulmonary tuberculosis. Well, these tables show that in total, consistent cigarette smoking increased the mortality from all causes throughout middle and old age by 80%. When, however, attention was concentrated on the last 20 years of the study, when most cigarette smokers were likely to have been smoking cigarettes regularly from youth rather than tobacco in pipes and cigars as they used to do in the old days, the overall mortality throughout middle and old age was found to have been doubled. The one negative relationship with Parkinsonism has also been found in many other studies, but its interpretation is unclear, for there seems to be some confounding between the activity of the cerebral receptors for nicotine and dopamine. After a further 10 years, when the doctors had been followed for half a century, I decided to close the study, though I am told that my colleague Richard Peter is going to follow it up until after I've died to see where I come. But no, he does intend to follow it for 60 years. I thought we might as well close it because there were so few continuing cigarette smokers left. In fact, only 134 out of the 5,902 survivors. That's not, of course, because all these cigarette smokers had been killed by their habit. The great majority of the doctors who smoked had given up. And I'll be able to show you some results that they're giving up shortly. Few new findings were obtained in the last 10 years, but we were able to show that for those who were known to have been consistently smoking cigarettes and only cigarettes from youth, the increase in total mortality was nearer triple than double, and that such a smoker lost on average 10 years of life. As the next slide, please. This shows the survival rate of the cigarette smokers from age 30 onwards, and the lifelong non-smokers, and there's a 10-year difference in the average survival. More importantly, perhaps, we now have clear evidence of the benefit of stopping smoking at any age. And the next slide, please, shows the rates of the lifelong non-smokers in 4 age groups, and then the rates of when you stop smoking at different ages compared with consistent regular smoking on the right. And stopping at age around about 30 is not actually shown on that table. There is hardly any harmful effect detected at all. That is to say, not in our population, where doctors had begun smoking on average at about the age of 18 and smoked about 18 a day. And as you'll see, stopping at 50, about half the risk, and stopping around 30 almost eliminated it. Well, these effects were particularly clear in the United Kingdom because cigarette smoking had become very common there earlier than elsewhere. But similar results have been obtained in all other countries where such studies have been carried out, including the USA, Canada, Australia, Finland, France, Germany, India, Japan, and China. The size of the effect, however, depending on the length of time that regular cigarettes or bidi smoking had been common. Our results also enabled us to show the extraordinary impact, may I have the next slide please, that modern medicine has had on the life expectancy of the elderly. For we had under observation elderly men in 5 decades, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Over the 40 years, from the mid-1950s to the mid-1990s, the chances of surviving from 70 to 90 years of age nearly tripled among lifelong non-smokers. That's shown on the left-hand column. And going from 11% to 32% chance of surviving to 90 from the age of 80. This, it seems to me, is something that national policies on pensions and retirement from work will need to take into account. Among smokers, however, the benefits of modern therapy were counteracted by the more prolonged smoking of cigarettes, and one saw no improvement in chances of survival, as is shown in the right. I might have these slides off for a moment, please, the light. The success of the epidemiological techniques we used in our original study of lung cancer encouraged me to undertake similar studies to check and quantify several suspected occupational hazards of lung and nasal cancer, and to determine the possible effect of steroid contraceptives when they were first introduced. The time available to me is, however, brief, and I shall limit my account to the effects of ionizing radiation and an estimate of the relative importance of the many avoidable causes that contribute to the total incidence of cancer. Now, I was attracted to the study of ionizing radiation when the first explosion of the first hydrogen bomb in the Pacific caused radioactive fallout throughout the northern hemisphere. Until then, such radiation, most often in the form of X-rays, has been known to cause cancer in most tissues of the body. But it has generally been assumed that it did so only when the dose was big enough to cause macroscopic damage to tissues. This now began to be questioned, and the government consequently asked the Medical Research Council to advise them on the possible hazards of the uses of nuclear energy, since many people might be exposed to very small doses. In July 1955, the Medical Research Council, in its turn, asked Michael Fort Brown, a young radiobiologist, and me, to try to find out what the relationship actually was between the dose of radiation to which people might be exposed and the consequent risk of leukemia, a malignant disease that was thought to be relatively easily produced by such exposures. A few cases of leukemia were known to have occurred in patients given radiotherapy as a treatment for ankylosing spondylitis. And they seemed an appropriate group to study, as many had been treated, and there was no clinical reason to suspect that any excessive leukemia would occur in the ordinary course of their disease. An answer was needed quickly, so we organized 4 groups of workers who travelled around the country extracting information about patients treated for the disease and detailed information about the treatments they had received in all the country's major radiotherapy centres. Altogether, a little over 13,000 patients were identified that had been treated over the previous 20 years, and among them we discovered 37 cases of leukemia from study of their hospital records and matching their names with nominal rolls of all people dying of leukemia that were held in the National Register of Deaths. There was insufficient time to do what we would have preferred to do, of course, namely to follow each patient individually to the end of our study. that our method was adequate at the time, as leukemia was then almost invariably fatal. There was at the time no way of estimating at all reliably what the dose of radiation was that each patient was likely to have received. So we had to construct a model man, and might I have the next slide, please, to show, and the lights off. When we succeed in getting that, we'll see the picture of the next slide of the model man we constructed. And then we inserted measuring devices at 3 places in the spine, and we exposed that model man to all forms of radiotherapy that have been used by the many different radiotherapists throughout the country over the previous 20 years, and measured the doses received in the spinal marrow, where most of the radiation, most of the marrow was. To estimate the numbers of different doses, the numbers receiving different doses, we divided the patients into 3 groups that received 1, 2, or 3 courses of treatment, and a 4th group that received 4 or more courses, or were treated in 2 or more centres, and then took random samples with different sampling ratios for each of the 4 groups, stratified by sex and by centre. We then calculated the doses that each patient had received from the detailed description of their treatment and the corresponding doses to the spinal marrow measured in the model man. The most reliable indication of the effects of a given dose was, we thought, revealed by the 18 cases in people who'd had irradiation directed only at the spine, because we had no direct measurement of the dose received in the marrow in other parts of the body. This is shown in the next slide, please. This led us to conclude that the risk was linearly proportional to dose, with no evidence of a threshold below which no effect was produced. Quantitatively, we estimated that the dose to the whole marrow that would double the incidence of the disease was between 0.3 and 0.5 gray. This estimate, it's turned out, is not very different from that now deduced from observation of the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosions over a much longer period, namely 0.22 gray. Subsequently followed up our patients all individually and found that we had, by our rough and ready method, missed only 1 case of leukemia in the relevant period. By the beginning of 1983, the mortality from leukemia in patients given 1 course of treatment was found to have been 3 times that expected in the absence of radiation, with a maximum risk 2.5 to 5 years after treatment, due entirely to an increased risk of acute leukemia and chronic myeloid leukemia. Chronic lymphatic leukemia, as in other subsequent studies, was unaffected. In other tissues other than the colon, which had to be omitted because colon cancer has an independent genetic relationship with ankylosing spondylitis, the mortality from cancer was found to have been increased by 28%, with a maximum excess relative risk 10 to 12.5 years after radiation. Estimates of the doses received in different tissues subsequently provided evidence of a dose-response relationship for all neoplasms other than leukemia and colon cancer, with an excess relative risk of 18% per gray in the period 5 to 25 years after exposure, which subsequently decreased to 11%, but didn't, in our study, ever disappear completely. Now these observations, we have the lights on again to it, these observations, and the much more important ones on the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosions, generated the hypothesis that the risk of cancer from exposure to ionizing radiation was linearly proportional to dose, down to vanishingly small levels. A hypothesis that was supported by laboratory studies. Oh, I don't want that yet, please, not never mind. We'll leave that. The hypothesis was supported by laboratory studies suggesting the risk was dependent on one or more genetic mutations. Small doses are positively beneficial. Nothing in my own work supports this last belief, nor the contrary view argued by some opposed to the use of nuclear energy that the effect of small doses has been played down. With Sarah Darby, I have attempted to assess the leukemogenic effect of the very small doses caused by radioactive fallout from the testing of nuclear bombs in the 1950s and early 1960s. The greatest fallout occurred over Scandinavia, and we sought to correlate the amount there with the local incidence of childhood leukemia, the disease most likely to have been affected. There had been, we concluded, some small increase in risk that was compatible with the standard estimate of what the dose would produce, but the excess was not statistically significant. And along with other similar findings near the Nevada testing site in the United States, was dismissed by those who didn't want to believe it. Conclusive evidence will, I suspect, be obtained from study of the small doses of alpha radiation from radon gas that accumulates almost everywhere in houses. Our own study of patients with lung cancer in southwest England, where the highest concentrations in homes in the UK are known to occur, points in the expected direction. But the 95% confidence limits of the observed relationship include a zero effect. And we shan't have a firm estimate of the relationship until we've seen the combined results of the 13 substantial European studies that a group of us have put together and are shortly to publish. Taking everything into account, both epidemiological and laboratory findings, 14 of us who have long had a special interest in the subject, both in the UK and in the United States, have agreed that a simple linear relationship down to a vanishingly low dose remains the most appropriate model for practical use, and we've recently published our conclusions to this effect in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. My last theme, to which I referred earlier, is the relative contribution of different factors to the avoidable causes of cancer. This was something I devoted much time to 25 years ago when the United States Office of Technology Assessment asked Peter and me to provide a report on it as background material to a report that the US government had asked them to produce. The subject had become of acute interest in the United States because of the public concern that had been created about the polluting effects of the chemical industry, due partly to Carson's book Silent Spring on how the widespread use of DDT had damaged the reproductive capacity of birds, partly to the trends in the incidence and mortality from cancer that were widely believed to be increasing, and partly to the report filed by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and subsequently accepted by the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare, to the effect that past occupational exposure to 6 established carcinogens was responsible for between 23 and 38% of all cancer deaths. These concerns, understandably, led many people to believe that industry, and characteristically the chemical industry, was responsible, in one way or another, for the great majority of all human cancers. But was it true? In our report, we showed that there was no good evidence for the belief that cancer was increasing in incidence, apart from the increase attributed to smoking, and none to support the idea that occupational hazards caused anything like the suggested risk, which had been based on inappropriately attributing the same high risks observed in a few small groups of workers who were exposed to very high doses of the agents to the millions of workers who might possibly have been exposed to very small amounts. We approached the problem first by showing that all types of cancer that were at all common in some communities were rare in others, and that the differences were not in general genetic in origin, although a few, of course, were, such as the differences in skin cancer due to differences in skin colour. This was clear because incidence rates change when people move between countries with different cultures, and because even within one culture, many incidence rates were changing over time. Now, this is not an occasion to re-examine the reasons we gave, but preferring to base our analysis on epidemiological observations and on laboratory studies, except perhaps for noting that epidemiology starts from, say, the 10,000 cancer deaths that occur annually in some cities, rather than the 10,000 chemicals that may be found to be polluting it. Epidemiology is admittedly more likely to overlook many very small effects of chemicals, but is much less likely to overlook the large determinations of contemporary cancer rates and trends. Nor is this an occasion to re-examine in detail the evidence we adduced to support our quantification of the important carcinogenic factors. And I note now only our conclusions as are summarized on this next slide. These were the conclusions we reached in 1981. Much more knowledge of the causes of cancer has, of course, subsequently been obtained, and the distribution of the important factors would look somewhat different now, and very different for developing countries and for East Asia, as indeed it was then, as it looked in the past. We now know that much more cancer is caused by infection than we had thought. Viruses that have been identified as causes of human cancer are listed in the next table here. The most important are a few specific types of the human papillomavirus, which are primarily responsible for nearly all causes of cervical cancer everywhere, some other genital cancers, and probably some cancers in the mouth and pharynx, and the hepatitis B and C viruses, which are responsible for most liver cancers in the high incidence areas of Africa and Asia. The effects of both these types of these viruses are exacerbated by cigarette smoking, but most of them can almost certainly be avoided by immunization. That against the hepatitis B virus has to be done in infancy and is already being carried out effectively in parts of China and Taiwan, where the risk is high. But that against the carcinogenic types of the human papillomavirus is still only in the stage of experimental testing, but I have every reason to think that it may be available for public use within a decade. Bacteria and parasites are also more important. There is incidentally a vaccine being developed against the Epstein-Barr virus, which is responsible for some of the nasopharyngeal cancer in South China. Bacteria and parasites are also more important than we then realized. The role of Helicobacter pylori in producing atrophic gastritis and subsequently gastric carcinoma had yet to be discovered. Not the principal cause of gastric cancer in the high incidence areas is still important in most parts of the world, chronic infection increasing the risk of the disease about sixfold. Schistosoma hematobium was then a well-recognized cause of bladder cancer in Egypt and East Africa, but it hadn't yet been recognized that Schistosoma japonicum was responsible for the high incidence of large bowel cancer in parts of China. Diet is still widely believed to be a cause of large proportions of cancer deaths, which Peter and I estimated to be as high as 35% in the United States, with wide confidence limits extending from 10% to 70%. Knowledge of the components that gave rise to or protect against cancer is, however, still confused. The one component on which I would have been prepared to bet on the basis of dietary analysis of specific blood levels, namely beta-carotene, has now been excluded by the results of controlled trials. The explanation is presumably confounding, but precisely what the apparently beneficial effect of beta-carotene is confounded with remains a mystery. The one thing that's now clearly important for many cancers is obesity. which in the United States is now the most important cause of cancer in non-smokers, including cancer of the breast in postmenopausal women and cancer of the large bowel, kidney and several other organs. In Europe, a recent estimate was that it was responsible for 6% of all cancers and steadily getting more important. Now, since writing our review on the causes of cancer, I haven't made any serious attempt to estimate the proportion of cases due to different factors in more recent years in the United States, China, or the developing world. I have, however, with others, taken part in a reanalysis of the hormonal factors that affect cancer of the breast, uterus and ovaries. We have as a result a much clearer picture of what determines the variation in the incidence of cancer of the breast, which continues to be one of the most common cancers, fatal cancers throughout the world. It's distinguished, however, by having the least variation of any cancer from one country to another, the range of incidence rates being no more than sixfold. It's clear now that the incidence is dependent almost entirely on a woman's history of reproduction, nutrition, and medication. The individual effects of the various factors have mostly been small, but it's been possible to clarify them by bringing together in a collaborative study the findings of all those who have made a special study of the relationship. Details of the effects of the principal factors, age at menarche, number of births, age at which births occur, obesity and height, have yet to be analysed. And I shall show in the last table, the next one please, only the effect of 5 minor factors. Individual studies have produced conflicting results, as was to be expected with the relatively small numbers of cases in each study, and the need to take into account the confounding effect of many others. But the results of the collaborative analysis, based mostly on over 50,000 cases of breast cancer and 100,000 controls in 53 different studies, are clear. Lactation, and this I think is important, reduces the risk if prolonged more than a few months. Steroid contraceptives increase it slightly, but only during their use. Hormone replacement therapy unfortunately increases it progressively with the length of time it's used. Abortion and smoking have no effect, while alcohol, sadly, increases the risk by 7.1% for every 10 grams consumed per day. There's much more to come from this study, and I cite these few results now primarily as an indication of the value of collaboration between epidemiologists, something that, in my opinion, will become increasingly to be needed in the future as more and more minor, but nevertheless socially important factors for many major diseases need to be assessed. It's been my good fortune to have had the opportunity of undertaking epidemiological investigations at a time when there were many major environmental and behavioral factors to be identified whose effects then had to be quantified. Epidemiological investigation since then has become more difficult, and larger studies have been needed to obtain clear results. The key to success in the future is, I suggest, collaboration, something which has been made clear in the earlier talk also this morning. And that is something, I'm glad to say, that seems to come naturally to epidemiologists throughout the world by virtue of the type of work that they undertake.
Thank you, Sir Richard.